Hello BookTube, it's Amy here. I would like to introduce to you one of the best memoirs ever written. This is called Memoirs from Beyond the Grave by François-René Chateaubriand. And it is one of the best memoirs I've ever read and probably the best book that I've read this year so far. So this particular edition is translated from the French by Alex Andris, and we do have a great introduction here by Anke Molstein. And in reading the introduction by Anke Molstein, I found out that this is one of the key works that influenced Marcel Proust in his writing of In Search of Lost Time, which makes a lot of sense as you read throughout, because you do see the themes of memory and looking back at the past come up quite a bit. And the structure is also somewhat reminiscent of Proust, because Chateaubriand is writing his memoirs from the year 1846, and he is inserting his 1846 self into these past events, into these past scenes, giving a little bit of a running commentary and creating a very introspective work. Very much in the same way that Marcel Proust would go on in the 20th century to write his In Search of Lost Time, with a narrator, with a character looking back on the past and being introspective and reflecting on those past events of his life. So François-René de Chateaubriand begins his memoir in 1768 at his birth, talking first a little bit about his family, about his eventual birth, about how he spent his childhood as the youngest son in the family and as someone who the family didn't really have great expectations for. His education was neglected a little bit. He spent a lot of time being rowdy and rough with neighborhood children, and he was perceived by some people in his childhood as a bit of a bad seed. And it wasn't until he was a little bit older, around the age of 8, that he was really taken in hand and sent off to get educated. And it was through the instigation of his mother that he began to learn Latin, and that education in Latin and in the classics gave him a great appreciation for poetry, but also for the mythology and the classics of Greek and Roman civilization, which make sort of broad appearances throughout his entire memoir. He is constantly drawing on allusions to Greek and Roman classics, which is quite delightful to read. But he also talks about in his childhood spending a lot of time with his sister Lucille, who actually reminded me a little bit of William Wordsworth's sister Dorothy. Chateaubriand had a very similar relationship, it seems, with his sister, especially when he was young. Unfortunately, he spent quite a number of years in exile away from his sister, but he describes his youth spent with his sister Lucille as the moment when he got into poetry, and they would write poetry together and nourish that love of poetry in each other. And he attributes that time spent with her and his closeness to her as the first moment when he realized that he could be a poet and eventually become a writer. But it wasn't until he was exiled in England in the 1790s that he actually began to write seriously, partly out of survival and partly out of a renewed religious vigor. Chateaubriand was well known for a couple of novellas, one called, let me just look at these titles, one called Italia and one called Renee, but he was also perhaps even better known for a religious work titled The Genius of Christianity, and he recounts how throughout most of the years of this memoir, it ends in 1800, just as he's going back to France. He's actually headed back to France in the final page of this book under a false Prussian passport. Up until that point, he hadn't been all that interested in religion, but during his exile in London, in England rather, he sort of grew this new appreciation for religion, which led to the writing of that work, The Genius of Christianity. And he admits that it's quite likely that his new religious outlook probably colors all the events that he describes in his memoir. And in the introduction, Molstein is quite rightly pointing out that this memoir is part memory and part myth. And there are some sort of factual inconsistencies that certainly lead the reader to believe that not everything that is described in this memoir is actually truth. For instance, he only spent about 5 months in 1791 in Canada and the United States, but he describes going to a lot of places. One minute he's in Niagara Falls, and the next he somehow made it all the way down to Florida. But the thing that I think is the most questionable in this memoir is his desire to discover the Northwest Passage. He leaves France sort of under unclear circumstances in this memoir. He says he's fearing for his life. You, of course, have the political events of the time, the revolution happening. And he thinks, maybe it's a good time to leave because some of my peers are being arrested and facing imprisonment and death. And so off he goes to America, as he calls it, the Americas. And by America, I think he means North America as the continent, because he then goes on to talk about being specifically in Canada and specifically in the United States. But he heads off to America, saying he's fleeing for his life, but also that he has this grand plan to discover the Northwest Passage, which is a little bit absurd, as he doesn't seem to have any experience with exploring or being in the wilderness. He's grown up, despite growing up in the French provinces, he's grown up in a relatively privileged existence in France. And I can only imagine what would have happened if he had actually tried to go that far north to look for the Northwest Passage and found himself up there in the autumn or the winter. I don't think he would have made it, but it is a little bit puzzling and equally unbelievable with the fact that the farthest north he ever makes it is to Niagara Falls. But there is a very excellent depiction of his visit to Niagara Falls, and he describes this feeling, which definitely leads to me to believe that he was actually at Niagara Falls. This feeling that I think many people get when they see something as enormous and undescribable as Niagara Falls. I mean, you get close enough to the falls that all you can hear is the roaring of the water, and it almost takes you out of reality. And he describes this feeling of wanting to get closer and wanting to hurl himself into the falls, and it's only his guide sort of keeping a hand on him, pulling him back, that he describes as keeping him from actually hurling himself into the falls. And all the people that have tried to actually go over Niagara Falls in a barrel or have committed suicide into the falls, I can definitely believe that he was actually there at Niagara Falls. But Chateaubriand led a very interesting life, which is part of what makes this memoir so interesting. The writing is excellent. It's structured in a way that I really loved, with the way that time is dealt with, and just the flow of events. And some of his lines are just really sharp. He talks at the start of this memoir about wanting to climb back up the slopes of his better years. And he talks about this idea of his cradle having something of the grave and his grave having something of the cradle in it. The idea that his entire life has been sort of connected to death, but also connected to birth. He sees this cyclical thing almost. And the memoir itself is full of tragedy in some ways, but it's also full of a very interesting life path. As I've said, he was a writer, and he became well known as a French writer, but he was also a diplomat in his later life. And he does, when he's looking back in 1846, he's actually in England again, this time representing the French government, which sort of enables him to look back as well on his past and to write this memoir. But he was prepared first for a life at sea. His mother and his father thought that he could be prepared to be a sailor and spend his life on the sea, since he was not really going to inherit much of anything from the family fortune. Although his family was part of that aristocratic class, they had lost much of their fortune, and there was really only money for the oldest son in the family. And so Chateaubriand had prepared himself to go to sea, but he gets to the point where he's actually like looking at the ship, looking at the ocean, and he's 16 years old. He's getting ready to sort of train to go into this career, and he changes his mind and goes back to the family estate and is welcomed with fairly warm, open arms, and expresses to his mother his desire to then join the church. He doesn't have that strong feelings for religion, for the church at that point, but he is able to stay at home with his sister for several more years under the guise that he is studying. And he is in fact studying, and he describes this very romantic and idealized lifestyle on the family estate, where they are isolated in one of the French provinces, sort of out in the wilderness almost, and there's not a lot of people coming by, so they don't get many guests. It's just him and his father, his mother, and his sister, and he stays in his room most of the morning under the assumption that he is studying in there. That's what his family believes, but he says, I didn't study much, I just pretty much did nothing all morning. Has meals with his family, takes long walks, writes poetry, spends time with his sister, and just lives this very peaceful life, which I think might have been, one of the most peaceful moments of his life before everything tends to fall apart a bit, because as he gets a little older and decides, I don't want to join the church, they send him off to join the military. He gets a position in the military, does some things in politics, some references to politics and to viewership that I didn't quite understand, not being that familiar with the French political structure at the time or with French history. But adding to the fact that he lived quite an exciting life, he actually had the chance to be introduced at court, introduced to the king and to the queen, and he describes a hunting trip that he took with the king. But although he had the chance to move in that circle, he describes not wanting to and withdrawing from that. And he proposes a trip to India, and eventually, as I've said, in 1791, off he heads to Canada and to the United States. Now, being that this was written almost 200 years ago, you can expect some of the things that might come out when a European arrives in North America and describes the people that he encounters there. And I was prepared for some cringy stuff, some really racist stuff. And it's not to say that a lot of the language in this memoir wasn't outdated. He's still referring to the indigenous peoples of North America as Indians and savages. But I was also pleasantly surprised at how much de Chateaubriand actually knew and how much he was willing to learn. He talks about the nations of the Great Lakes regions, and actually points out that before Europeans colonized North America, they had numerous governance structures, and he actually compares them to being as numerous as the governance structures of the Old World. And he straight up comments on the fact that, as he calls it, civilized nations, monarchies and republics alike, like to divide up land that doesn't belong to them, which is a direct commentary, I think, on the fact that all these nations and all these peoples had existed and were still living on that land, and it had been divided up by people who it didn't belong to. And I think he's very open-minded about learning about these different peoples that he encounters. It's not that racist undertone that you often get in other memoirs of the era. It's certainly not Susanna Moody or anything like that. But of course he does highly romanticize everything about North America. And he makes comparisons between indigenous cultures and ancient Greek and Roman culture. And he does have this idea that the best parts of the cultures that he's encountering are gone and they're ancient, rather than something that was very present and still living. You know, Chateaubriand wasn't perfect, but he does seem to recognize some things that other contemporaries of his did not in their writings. One of the things that I also found interesting about this memoir was his nostalgia and almost regret for the collapse of French power in North America. He is, of course, visiting some of the areas that had once been under French power, and he's got this great little passage here reflecting on the loss of French power in North America, and it's once again very romanticized. For someone who often seems to have fled from conflict and danger, he does have a knack for romanticizing battles and war. So he writes here, "I took my leave of the old sachem. He had been present at the taking of Quebec. Among all the disgraceful events of the reign of Louis XV, this episode of the Canadian War consoles us, as though it were a page of our ancient history, recovered from the Tower of London. Montcalm, charged with defending Canada, unaided and fighting against forces frequently replenished, and 4 times as numerous, battles on successfully for 2 years. He defeats Lord London and General Abercrombie. Finally, fortune abandons him. Wounded beneath the walls of Quebec, he collapses, and 2 days later he breathes his last. His grenadiers bury him in a crater opened by a bomb, a grave worthy of the honor of our arms. His noble enemy, Wolfe, dies a few feet away from him. He pays for Montcalm's life with his own, and has the glory of dying on a few French flags." And there's another passage where he almost scolds the French government for abandoning what was then Lower Canada, Arcadia, and Louisiana over the years. And despite actually returning to France from North America upon hearing about the fall of the king to then join the king's army and fight for him, he recognizes throughout the book in some very well-crafted passages that he's not one to get involved in those sort of things. He says here on page 231 in book 5, and this is actually before he goes to North America, he says, "Ever since my youth, my political impartiality has pleased no one. What's more, I attached importance to the questions at issue only when they concerned universal ideas of liberty and human dignity. Personal politics bored me. My life lay on higher ground." And he describes sitting in a theater to sort of numb his mind and distract himself in the midst of the political turmoil. He says, "I must have been intrepid enough to see Barbe Bleue and Sabbat Perdu 20 nights running at the Italians, boring myself in an effort to drive boredom away, perched like an owl in a hole in the wall. All the while the monarchy collapsed. I heard neither the cracking of the ancient vaults, nor the caterwaul of vaudeville, nor the thundering voice of Mirabeau at the tribunal, nor Colin singing to Babette of the theatre." And it's this image of perched in a hole in the wall like an owl. And I think that describes him for much of this memoir. For close to 2 decades, he's always perched somewhere, huddled up somewhere, just trying to survive. And as I said, he does spend most of the 1790s in exile in England, and he escapes very much at the expense of others. He is attempting to leave with his brother, and they have a servant, a footman, who is traveling with them, and they're all under false papers. And the footman gets found out and thrown from the carriage, and de Chateaubriand doesn't say anything. He feels he can't say anything because then he too will be thrown from the carriage and his life put in jeopardy. And even when he makes it to England, he has abandoned his other brother left behind in France. He has abandoned his mother, he has abandoned his sister, and he has abandoned his own wife, who he only really spent 8 months with after marrying. And we learn that his mother is in prison, his sister is in prison, and his wife is in prison. And the reason that his wife and sister are in prison is because they are accused of helping him to flee. And his immigration is seen as a crime. And we also learn eventually that his brother, who has married into a very wealthy family with ties to the monarchy, his brother and his sister-in-law have been publicly executed. And he learns that while he is staying in England, and he nearly actually starves to death in England. And the man that he is renting a room with, they sort of make a pact that they're going to have nothing but hot water and one roll a day. And one morning he goes to have their meager breakfast with his friend at 10 a.m. and discovers that he has stabbed himself with a penknife. And so of course he calls a doctor and loses track of his friend at that point. But he wasn't living in luxury despite his exile. He was very much just barely scraping by, and it's through the help of acquaintances and friends and money sent from his uncle that he is able to survive. And he doesn't talk much about it here, but it is this time in England, this time in exile, this time of great sorrow, of learning these things about his friends and family and about the death of his brother, that he does turn to religion and turn to writing and the idea of being a writer. So overall, just a fantastic memoir, something I would highly recommend. And as I said, it is a work that influenced Marcel Proust, and I do believe it has influenced many, many French writers before and after Proust. Definitely a hidden treasure that I'm so glad has been published in an NYRB edition here. And the cover art is great. The image here is, I believe, an image of Niagara Falls, which immediately brings to mind that moment when Chateaubriand was standing on the shores of the falls, surrounded by the roaring water and fighting that urge to throw himself in, fighting that urge to be absolutely self-destructive and be overwhelmed by the forces of nature, and I guess the forces of life as well. So check this out if you're interested.